So today we're going to be talking about the Feast of Shavuot, or sometimes called the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost. It was called the closing festival because it ended the harvest season, and after this festival, this harvest, then there would be a 4-month interval. And these first 4 feasts, Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and weeks, point to Christ's first coming, his death, the sinlessness of his sacrifice, his resurrection, and the birth of the church. So Shavuot, or weeks, points to the birth of the church. And then there's a 4-month interval between the first set of feasts and the second set of feasts, which point to the church age. And you will be getting a handout on that next week, and you will be getting a handout through the email on Shavuot this week. Rashit, or first fruits, the Jews refer to as the early first fruits because it was a barley harvest. Shavuot they refer to as the latter first fruits because it was a wheat harvest. But let's look at Leviticus and just read what the Bible says, the biblical practice in Leviticus 23, verses 15 through 22. Then you were to count from the morrow after Shabbat, from the day that you brought the omer of wave offering, 7 complete Sabbaths. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you are to count 50 days. So that's where you get Pentecost from, because Pentecost is the Greek word for 50. And then present a new grain offering, a wheat grain offering, in other words, to Adonai. You are to bring out of your houses 2 loaves of bread for the wave offering, made of 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour. So there were 2 loaves on one sheet. 2 loaves on one sheet. And that's really important, as you'll see in a second here. They are to be baked with hametz, leaven. This is the only feast that they're supposed to bake with leaven, which points to their sinful nature. As the first fruits of Adonai, you are to present along with the bread 7 one-year-old lambs without blemish, 1 young bull, 2 rams. It will become a burnt offering to Adonai with their meal offering and their drink offerings, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to Adonai. Also, you are to offer 1 male goat for a sin offering and a pair of year-old male lambs for a sacrifice of fellowship offerings. The Cohen, or the priest, is to wave them with the bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before Adonai with 2 lambs. Then they will be holy to Adonai for the priest. You are to make a proclamation on the same day that there is to be a holy convocation, and you should do no regular work. In other words, it would be considered a Sabbath day. This was a statute forever. James, right there. Forever, in all your dwellings throughout your generations. Okay. So the biblical practice was, it was a 1-day feast. It was one which we learned in Deuteronomy was a pilgrim feast. There are 3 pilgrim feasts, or travel feasts, where every able-bodied Jewish man was supposed to come back to Israel. If he could bring his family, that would be great, but he had to come back. And that was Passover, unleavened bread, which was considered one feast, Shavuot. Those were the 3. only feast to use leaven, 2 loaves, 1 sheet. Okay, that's the biblical practice. Now, it's interesting that in verse 22 here, the next verse, which you'll receive a handout on this, is kind of an interlude between the first set and the second set, between the spring festivals and the fall festivals. And verse 22 says, "Now when you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap to the furthest corners of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Rather, you are to leave them for the poor and for the outsider, for I am Adonai your God." This is what we're supposed to be doing during the dispensation of grace, during the church age. It's also right there where you get to the book of Ruth, when they leave the gleanings on the outside, which Ruth went around and picked up. That's where they got that, was from Leviticus 23:22. The Jewish observance has changed since then. It was a fall festival for farmers, and they would go out to the fields and they would gather grapes and figs and pomegranates and olive oil and honey. And then part of the wheat offering was baked into 2 loaves on 1 sheet. And then they would go to the temple with flutes and other musical instruments, and it would be offered in a special ceremony where the high priest would stand here. So here's the temple, most holy place, bronze altar, court of the women. Court of the women. And he would stand here at the Nicanor gate where they had the steps, 15 steps, and he would do a wave offering. He would wave those all facing in all 4 directions there. Right. And it was a public statement of God's provision for his people. Once again, just like first fruits, this is the latter first fruits. There was no guarantee that they would be able to harvest the rest of the wheat harvest. I mean, you could have a hailstorm, disease, locust, or whatever. So, but what they're saying is, by faith, we are gathering these first fruits with the hope of more to come, with the promise of more to come. And of course, last week when we did the Reshit and first fruits, the promise of more to come and the messianic significance was us, because Jesus rose, and he was the promise, with the promise of more to come. The more to come is us. And so in this feast, the wheat harvest, they would make a statement of God's provision with the promise of more to come in their wheat harvest. Since 70 AD, obviously things have changed because there is no temple. So they couldn't do that. So what they do today is they continue with no fasting. It wasn't a feast with fasting. And they have, like the Jews always seem to do, they have added things. So one of the things they have added is 3 days of consecration. Now, let's turn to Exodus 19. Exodus 19. (10) to 13. Now, we're at Mount Sinai, and Adonai said to Moses, "Go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothing. Be ready for the 3rd day, for on the 3rd day Adonai will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and you are to set boundaries for the people all around, saying, be very careful not to go up to the mountain or touch it on the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain will surely be put to death. Not a hand is to touch it, but he will surely be stoned or shot through. Whether it is an animal or a man, it will not live. When the shofar sounds, then they may come up to the mountain. Now, they know that generally, people trace the Exodus, and they knew that generally this took place in the spring. But what the Jews have done today, they say that the law was given on Shavuot. The Torah was given on Shavuot. Let me say both the Torah and the oral law, both of them. They believe that God not only gave Moses, the 10 commandments to carry down, he gave him all of the 613 commandments in the 5 books of Moses on that day. And Moses went up to heaven and came back down with the oral law, which was not true. That's what they teach. So what I'm saying to you is today, in many congregations, Jewish congregations, there is like 3 days of consecration, 3 days of setting themselves apart, 3 days of preparation for Shavuot, because they teach that the Torah and the oral law were given on Shavuot. The next thing is the book of Ruth is read, because once again, tradition, so many times when I say that word, I think of the Catholic Church, because there are so many traditions, in the Catholic Church, and once again, many equate those traditions equally as Scripture, just like the Jews do the oral law with the Torah. But tradition says that King David, who was a descendant in the last little bit of Ruth, when they give a genealogy in the last of Ruth, that David was a descendant of Ruth. The tradition in Jewish circles is that King David was born and died on Shavuot. Born and died. So, as a result, it's a tradition that the book of Ruth is read on Shavuot. Milk products are emphasized because the Bible says that the promised land was supposed to be a land filled with milk and honey. So they emphasize milk products. The challah, which is the bread, is normally like on a regular Sabbath, it's braided. Almost looks like a girl's hair is braided, okay? But on Shavuot, they make it in the form of a ladder, because they say that Moses took a ladder and went up to heaven to get the oral law. So they form their challah in the form of a ladder. And then lastly, there's kreplach, K-R-E-P-L-A-C-H, kreplach, which is kind of a Jewish ravioli without the tomato sauce. It's just like in a triangle. It's like a triangle. And, the rabbis can't help themselves. They have to have a reason why it's in a triangle. So they say, well, and these could be endless, but some examples are, it stands for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It stands for the 3 divisions of the Torah, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. But there's kreplach. And they have a big celebration today.